All right, let's dive in. We're going to tackle a topic that can feel, massive and super complex, but it's one that quietly shapes so many of our lives, the stock market. So let's pull back the curtain and really make sense of it all. So let me ask you something right off the bat. Are you an investor? Your first thought might be, nope, no way. That's for the pros in suits on Wall Street. But what if I told you that the answer is probably yes? Well, here's the thing. If you have a pension fund, there's a really good chance you're already an investor, whether you realize it or not. And that makes understanding how all this works not just some abstract idea, but something that's directly tied to your own financial future. All right, let's kick things off with our first section. Welcome to the market. So, what is this thing we hear about on the news practically every single day? Probably the easiest way to think about the stock market is to just picture a gigantic shopping center. Seriously. But instead of buying milk and bread, people are there buying and selling little pieces of companies. It's really just a marketplace that makes all that trading possible. And, just like any big city has its famous malls, the market has its famous locations. You've probably heard of the New York Stock Exchange, the NYSE. That's the biggest one in the world. Then there's the NASDAQ, which is the biggest electronic market. And up in Canada, you've got the Toronto Stock Exchange, or TSX. These are really the big leagues, the main arenas where all the action happens. Section 2. What is a stock? Okay, so if the market is the shopping center, what are we actually buying? Let's take a look at the most common item you'll find on the shelves. It's called a stock, or sometimes you'll hear it called a share. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a tiny, tiny piece of a company. When you buy a stock, you are literally buying ownership of a small fraction of that entire business. I mean, think about that for a second. You're not just betting on a symbol on a screen. You are becoming a part owner of a real company with a real claim on its stuff and its future profits. That right there is the whole point of investing. Which brings us to, well, probably the biggest question of all. Why do the prices change? Why are they always bouncing up and down? What is actually driving all that movement? It might seem insanely complicated, but at its very core, it's all driven by a super simple rule you definitely learned back in school: the law of supply and demand. That one single principle is behind pretty much every price change you will ever see. It really is just a constant tug of war. When more people want to buy a stock than sell it, all that demand pushes the price higher. And of course, the opposite is true. If more people are trying to sell than there are people willing to buy, that extra supply drives the price right down. Every single price you see is just the result of this ongoing battle. So what's actually causing this tug of war? Well, we can kind of boil it down to three big forces. First up, you've got the health of the company itself. Is it making money? Then there's the wider economy, stuff like interest rates and inflation. And third, and this one's huge, it's just human factors. Investor confidence, fear, and how people react to big news stories. Okay, and when you go to look up a stock quote, you're going to see a few key terms. The bid, that's the highest price any buyer out there is willing to pay right now. The ask is the lowest price a seller is willing to accept. And last is simple. That's the price where the last actual trade happened. Getting these three is like learning the first few words of the market's language. Section 4, reading the market's mood. So how do we zoom out from just one stock and get a sense of how the entire market is feeling? How do we know if the whole shopping center had a good day or a bad day? Well, that's where something called a stock index comes in. You can basically think of it as the daily sales report for our shopping center. It just tracks a whole bunch of stocks together to give us a quick snapshot of how a piece of the market, or the whole shebang, is doing. I guarantee you've heard these names kicked around. The S&P 500 tracks 500 of the biggest companies in the US, so it gives you a really broad picture of the economy. The Dow Jones is another famous one, but it only tracks 30 huge companies. When the news says the market was up today, they're almost always talking about one of these indexes. Which naturally leads us to the million-dollar question, or maybe the trillion-dollar question. Can you take all this information and actually predict what the market is going to do next? And look, the honest-to-goodness answer is, it's just unbelievably hard. Trying to predict the market's day-to-day wiggles with any kind of real accuracy is pretty much impossible. There are way too many moving parts. And that's exactly why the smartest folks in the game, they don't even try to predict. They prepare. It's like the legendary investor Warren Buffett says, the goal isn't to guess what will happen tomorrow. The goal is to understand the company, invest in solid businesses, and this is the most important part, focus on the long term.
Okay, so with that long term mindset front and center, what are the actual first steps you should take if you're thinking about getting started?
And here's the great news. You really don't have to be some Wall Street genius to begin. But just jumping in without any kind of plan, that can be risky. The key is to be thoughtful and take it one step at a time. So, think of this as your pre-flight checklist. First, define your strategy. What are you even saving for and how much risk are you comfortable with? Second, pick the right account. Many places have tax-advantaged plans like a TFSA or RRSP in Canada that can really help. And third, decide how you'll invest. Are you going to work with a pro or use one of those do-it-yourself online platforms?
And as you get going, please remember this. The market is going to zig and zag every single day. There will be good days and bad days, that's a guarantee. But historically, when you zoom out and look at the big picture, the long-term trend has been upward. So we've covered the basics of what the market is and how it sort of works. At the end of the day, the right question isn't what stock should I buy tomorrow? It's what company do I want to understand better? Now that you have the framework, what's just one company you're curious to learn more about? Because that curiosity, that's the real start of any investor's journey.